I remember the pen. Not the lies, not the fake smiles, not even the folder with the worn edges and the coffee stain on page 3. Just the pen, blue ink, silver body, heavier than it needed to be. It rested between my fingers the way a rifle used to in my younger years. Back then, when I carried weight that mattered. But this pen wasn't a weapon, it was a surrender. Just a formality, Dad, my son had said, his voice smooth like he was pitching a deal to a client instead of tricking his own father. This is to make sure the land stays in the family, right? I nodded, my hands stiff with arthritis but steady enough. I didn't read it. I trusted him. The farm had been mine since I was 25. It was the first thing I ever owned that didn't belong to a bank or a man with a tighter jaw than mine. 47 acres of stubborn soil and cedar trees that outlived better men. I buried my wife beneath the old hickory, the one that leaned east every time the wind from the highway shifted. I watched deer grow bold around the property line. I watched drought burn through the grass, and snow fall so thick I once slept in the barn with the generator humming like a second heartbeat. I lived that land. Loved it. More than I loved most people. So when Ethan said he'd take care of it, when he told me the family needed legal protection from estate taxes, I believed him. And then, 2 weeks later, I saw the sign. For sale. Prime development land. 47 acres. Contact Ethan Warner, Warner Group Realty. My name wasn't on it. Not the land. Not the sign. Not even the memory. He didn't answer when I called. Not the first time. Not the second. On the third try, his assistant picked up and told me Ethan was in a meeting. Big project, she said. Something about breaking ground by winter. I hung up. Sat on the porch in silence. The wind bent the trees in my yard like they were bowing. Maybe they were mourning. I wanted to scream. I didn't. I wanted to drive straight to his office, slam my cane on his desk and demand answers. I didn't do that either. Instead, I looked at the old topography maps in my study, the ones I'd kept rolled in tubes for years, land elevations, soil reports, and a separate folder labeled subsurface rights, private ownership. They forgot one thing. They took my land. But they didn't take what was underneath it. The first time I saw the land, it was nothing more than brush and forgotten fence posts, bones of someone else's failed dream. It wasn't even for sale officially. Just a note pinned on the bulletin board in the back of the feed store, 47 acres. South line near gravel pit. Inquire within. I inquired. Drove out in my beat-up '69 Ford with the cracked windshield and a full thermos of coffee. The road back then wasn't even paved. Just red clay and loose gravel, the kind that rumbled under your tires like a warning. And when I got there, I knew. Not because it looked like much, there were tire ruts, 2 busted gates, and the beginnings of erosion on the northern slope, but because it felt unowned. Like the land had been waiting for someone to fight for it. I paid $36,000 for it in 1978. Took me 11 years to pay it off. No loans. No partners. Just calloused hands, second jobs, and a stubborn refusal to let the bank win. My wife, Carol, thought I was crazy at first. This place doesn't even have a well, she said, wiping sweat from her brow as we stood in what would become the kitchen. You bought 47 acres and a deer blind. I laughed. Then we've got something in common. We're both fixer-uppers. We built everything ourselves. Hauled timber. Dug the post holes. Installed plumbing with books from the library and mistakes that flooded the basement twice before we got it right. Every winter was a battle. Every spring, a reward. We raised chickens, then goats, then dreams bigger than we could afford. Carol ran the small greenhouse out back and sold herbs to restaurants in town before anyone cared about organic. I worked construction during the week and came home to pour concrete footings by flashlight. When Ethan was born, Carol swaddled him in a blanket sewn from her wedding dress. He took his first steps on floorboards I'd laid with my own hands. Learned to count by feeding animals. Learned to lie when he was 16 and totaled my truck, then claimed it was a hit and run. I should have seen it then. But I chalked it up to youth. Carol passed 12 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She lasted longer than they said she would, long enough to harvest one last batch of basil, to make one last batch of her famous sun-dried tomato jam, and to whisper, "Don't let this place die with me," as I held her hand under the soft wheeze of hospital machines. I buried her by the hickory tree with no headstone, just a wooden bench and a plaque that read, "Loved in every season." After that, I changed. Not in the loud ways people notice. I still fixed fences, still plowed the gravel drive, still paid my taxes on time. But inside, I'd gone quiet. Like the land itself. Ethan moved away not long after Carol passed. Took a marketing job in Austin. I didn't blame him. Young men weren't made to sit still on inherited soil. He'd call sometimes. Always busy, always with some new strategy or pitch. His voice got slicker every year. More polite, more distant. But I was his father. I didn't ask for much. Then 3 years ago, he came back. "Work's gone remote," he said. "Thought I'd come home for a while, help out with things." He was charming. Bought groceries without being asked. Repaired the barn roof with me in September. Said he wanted to learn how to be part of the land again. But he never asked about the soil. Never walked the creek bed. Never sat by Carol's bench. He stayed on his phone, pacing the porch, always with earbuds in and phrases like asset-rich but cash-poor, and agri-residential blend potential. He said he wanted to protect the legacy. That was the phrase he used. Just needed me to sign some papers so he could start organizing things properly. He told me it was smart. That Carol would have approved. I looked at him and thought, maybe I raised him wrong. Or maybe I didn't raise him enough. Still, I signed. I'd raised my whole life on trust. Now I was the fool. But not a blind one. Because 20 years ago, when a developer tried to run a pipeline through the county, I got smart. Quietly bought the subsurface mineral rights for every inch of my land and filed it under a separate LLC with my name only. I'd planned to leave it untouched, something for Ethan one day, maybe for his children. But they took what was above ground. They forgot what lived below. I'd buried more than just my wife on that land. I'd buried leverage. The sign was still there a week later. It had rained twice, enough to soak the bottom of the plywood and tilt it slightly east. But the words hadn't faded. Prime development land. 47 acres. Call Ethan Warner. I drove past it every morning, like a scab I couldn't stop picking. Watching pickup trucks pull into the gravel path I'd carved with Carol. Men in reflective vests. Women in boots with clipboards. They looked at the land like it was a blank canvas. Like it had never been a home. One of them waved at me once. I didn't wave back. Ethan didn't show up until the second week. Pulled up in a black SUV I'd never seen, windows tinted like he had something to hide. He didn't get out at first. Just sat there, engine running, scrolling through his phone. When he finally stepped onto the driveway, he smiled like nothing had happened. "Hey, Pop," he said. "How you holding up?" I didn't answer. Just stared at him, hands in my pockets. "Look, I know you're upset. I should have explained everything up front. But you've got to understand, this is a good deal. We're talking millions. Enough for you to finally stop working this place. You deserve rest." "I didn't ask for rest," I said. He looked past me toward the barn. "They're planning to put in a small luxury neighborhood. Not a strip mall or anything. Real tasteful. There'll be trees left. Maybe a park. Hell, we might even name one of the streets after you, Hayes Hollow or something. I felt something tighten in my chest, sharp and cold. You sold the land. No, no. I just signed a deal to broker it. Legally, the LLC owns it now. And since you signed the transfer, I'm the managing member. So technically, we're both in control. I shook my head. I'm not in control of anything. That's not true, he said quickly, stepping closer. You're still here. Still part of the story. Look, I know this place means a lot to you. But it's time to pass the torch. It's not 1980 anymore. You need to think about legacy. I stared at him for a long time. You think legacy is money? He paused. It helps. I didn't speak. Just turned around and walked back toward the porch. Behind me, I heard his voice, lighter, casual, like we were just having coffee. I'm handling everything, Pop. You just enjoy your days, okay? You'll get your share once the permits go through. Trust me. Trust him. That night, I found the contract. Buried in the pile of documents he'd left on my desk months ago. The pages were filled with language I hadn't recognized at the time, terms like revocable designation, managing member privileges, and partial asset liquidity. But I saw it now. Page 6. Full rights and management of the LLC, upon signature, shall transfer to Ethan Warner. My name was there, in small font under a larger one. Signed, Roy Hayes. I'd signed my land away. Not just the title. Not just the use. I'd signed away the bones, the trees, the hickory where Carol rested. He'd built a company around my name. Hayes Heritage Holdings, LLC. A clean, rustic brand. He used photos from my albums, Carol's greenhouse, the old barn with the red tin roof. Marketed it as agri-chic. I didn't even know what that meant. What I did know, what Ethan didn't, was that the mineral rights were never part of the deal. They belonged to a different entity. An LLC I'd formed with Carol in 2003, during the pipeline battle. Hidden Acres Subsurface Holdings. Different name. Different account. Different legal signature. And I still had the original certificate, sealed in a fireproof box behind my bookshelf. The next morning, I called the county records office. Asked a few quiet questions. Pulled up some maps online. Saw exactly where the developers planned to break ground. South Ridge. East Slope. Both areas with high mineral density, shale, sandstone, and trace natural gas. I didn't have much. But I had something they couldn't drill through. I let Ethan believe I was sulking. He didn't call. Didn't visit. Too busy booking meetings and posing for drone footage. But I knew what he was doing. He was building a future on stolen earth. He thought I'd stay quiet. He forgot I'd lived through worse men than him. I didn't leave the house for 3 days. Not because I couldn't. I'd survived winters with 2 slipped discs and a broken space heater. I'd driven through whiteouts and wildfires. I wasn't weak. But something inside me refused to move. I sat in the chair by the front window, the one Carol used to nap in during long afternoons. The cushion had sunk a little too far to one side from her weight, and I never bothered to fix it. Her imprint stayed. The wind rattled the windows. The sky hung low and gray. And I just sat there, coffee cold on the table, knees stiff, fingers twitching with nothing to fix. The hickory tree stood in the distance, barely visible through the glass. Bare branches like bones. Carol's bench beneath it, wet from the last storm. I wondered if the roots could feel betrayal, if trees knew what it meant to be owned by people who didn't care what they stood for. I watched trucks come and go. Ethan's people. Surveyors. Drone pilots. They didn't wave anymore. Maybe he'd warned them I was sensitive. Maybe they just didn't see me at all. There was a hollowness in my chest I couldn't name. Not rage. Not grief. Something deeper, colder, like the kind of silence that follows an empty church bell. He'd taken it. All of it. With a smile, a pitch, and a pen. I kept replaying our last real conversation, not the one on the driveway but the one 6 months before when he first came back. I just want to do something with the land, he said. Not to it. Make it work for us. I'd believed him. Thought maybe, finally, he'd come home for real. I even cleaned the barn out. Bought a new chainsaw. Talked about starting beehives like Carol always wanted. I'd begun to imagine a season where we worked side by side again, father and son, soil and sweat, rebuilding what time had taken. Instead, he'd stripped it like bark. He called once. Left a voicemail. Hey Pop, just checking in. Hope you're resting. Don't forget to take your blood pressure meds. I deleted it. The silence afterward was a kind of mercy. On the third night, I stood in the hallway by our wedding photos, the only place I kept framed memories. Carol in her Sunday dress. Ethan as a boy, standing next to the new barn with a goat he named Duke. He'd been afraid of thunderstorms back then. I used to sit on the floor next to his bed and count the seconds between lightning and thunder. Don't be scared, I'd whisper. It's just the sky stretching. Now I understood what silence between storms really meant. It was in the paperwork I never read. In the silence after he got what he wanted. In the absence of apology. I walked into the guest room, the one where Carol's sewing machine still sat covered in muslin. The fabric was untouched. She hadn't used it the year before she passed. Said her hands didn't work right anymore. But I left it there anyway, as if it might hum again if the wind shifted just right. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked. I'd meant to patch it. Meant to do a lot of things. I whispered, I'm sorry, but I didn't know who I was talking to. Carol. Myself. The land. Maybe all three. For a brief, honest second, I wished I hadn't lived this long. Wished the cancer that took Carol had taken me too, or that the accident in '92 had been just a little worse. Anything to avoid this sensation of watching your legacy evaporate, not from fire or flood, but from the smooth hands of your own blood. I was a man without ground. A farmer with no field. A father with no son. A home without roots. When the dawn broke the next morning, it was colorless. But I was still here. And something in the air had changed. Not warmer. Not brighter. Just clearer. The next morning, I got dressed like it was any other workday. Old denim shirt. Corduroy pants with the knees worn thin. My boots, the same pair I'd had resoled twice. I took my time tying the laces. There's something about dressing for your own resurrection. You don't rush it. I made coffee, black, no sugar, and stood on the porch while it brewed. The sky was heavy with clouds, like it hadn't made up its mind about raining. The air smelled like wet pine and silence. I looked out across the land, my land, no matter what the paperwork said. Every contour still lived in my bones. The hill where Carol planted wild mint. The bend in the fence where Duke used to get his head stuck. The low corner by the barn where rain pooled and frogs sang loud enough to keep us up nights in June. Ethan saw acreage. I saw memory. I didn't feel anger that morning. Not like before. The fire had burned down to coals, hot, steady, and useful. I walked into the study and unlocked the fireproof box. The deed to Hidden Acre Subsurface Holdings sat inside, crisp and intact. The LLC was never connected to the surface land in title. Carol insisted on keeping it separate. Said we'd earned it. Said one day someone might try to take what we built, but they'd never think to look beneath it. God, she was right. I laid the documents out on the kitchen table. Ownership. Filing dates. Mineral surveys. The county map showing the fault line with its seam of shale and embedded natural gas. It wasn't worth much when we bought it, just a curiosity. But now, with gas prices climbing and land development booming, it was leverage. Quiet. Legal. Undeniable. And it was still mine. I called my old friend Walter, a retired geologist who owed me more favors than he could count. He picked up on the second ring. Roy. Been a while. I need you to check something for me. Confidential. Always. By the end of the day, I had an updated survey. Confirmed pockets of extractable gas beneath the proposed development zones. It wasn't a gold mine, but it was enough to halt everything, if I wanted it to. I spent the next 48 hours in motion. Calm. Focused. Filed paperwork to activate the LLC's protections. Filed intent to restrict subsurface access. Filed notice to the city planning board about potential mineral disruption. Then, I called a small law firm in town. Not big. Just sharp. I'm not suing, I said. Yet. I'm notifying. Preemptively. I want it on record that this land is occupied, legally, spiritually, and otherwise. They understood. I didn't tell Ethan. Not yet. Instead, I drove the perimeter of the property and remarked the boundaries with red stakes. Not for him. For me. Reclaiming it in inches. In silence. At the southern slope, I stood beneath the old cedar and ran my hand along the bark. The ground beneath me wasn't just soil. It was resistance. I whispered to the wind, "This is where the line is." The next morning, I printed everything. Made 3 copies. One for the county. One for the planning board. One for Ethan. I left his in a sealed envelope with his assistant at his office. Didn't sign it as Dad. Signed it as Roy Hayes, Managing Member, Hidden Acres Holdings. No calls came. No texts. Just silence. The way Ethan used to fear thunder when he was little. That was me now, the rumble in the distance, quiet, slow, but undeniable. They thought they buried me under paperwork. They forgot I knew how to rise from the dirt. It started with the permit delays. 2 weeks after Ethan's office received my mineral rights claim, the city halted progress on his development. Official language, full of polite hedging, pending subsurface resolution, potential conflict of interest, environmental risk assessment required. Behind the words was something simpler: I'd pulled the brake on his future. Ethan didn't call. He sent an email. Short. Clipped. "Dad, I don't understand what this is. I thought we were partners." I didn't reply. Let him sit with the phrase. Partners. I kept busy. Spent my mornings walking the land, taking photographs of Carol's garden, the sloping fence lines, the tree roots buckling up through the creek. Every image dated, time-stamped, filed. Proof of continuity. Proof the land wasn't vacant, wasn't abandoned. I posted them online. Not on Facebook, Ethan still had access to that. I used a quiet blog site, one only old-timers and archivists bothered with. The Last Acre. I wrote small stories beneath the pictures. About the day Carol fell asleep under the oak with a tomato on her chest. About Ethan's 6th birthday when the goat escaped into the kitchen. About the frost in '97 that turned the barn into a crystal sculpture overnight. It was the kind of writing people don't expect from men like me. Within 3 weeks, the blog had 2,000 readers. Local historians shared it. A county librarian asked if she could archive it. A preservation group emailed me, curious about the status of the land, wondering if it qualified for heritage designation. That made me laugh. Quietly. Bitterly. Ethan called 3 times. I didn't answer. When he showed up at the house, I watched him from the porch. He didn't knock. Just stood by the driveway in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, blinking against the sun like it offended him. He finally shouted, "Can we please just talk?" I sipped my coffee. "You've got your land. Fine. You win. Just let me have the development. You'll still get your payout." I said nothing. "You're throwing away everything over principle." That word again. Like it was a disease. I walked inside and shut the door. Let him yell at Wood. 2 days later, I got an envelope in the mail. Certified. Legal letterhead. His lawyer. Inside was a proposal to buy the mineral rights, full acquisition, fast transfer, $200,000. I stared at the number. Big. Clean. But empty. I folded the paper and set it in the fireplace. Didn't even bother to burn it. Just left it there, like trash too unworthy for flames. Instead, I called Walter again. "I want to lease it," I said. "Drilling?" "No," I said. "Just enough to tie it up legally. Slow them down. Force acknowledgement." Within the week, I had a lease agreement with a small gas company. Not extraction, just exploratory. The deal was modest. But it created an easement. A legal footprint. No development could proceed without permission. The news made its way to Ethan. I could tell by the silence that followed. A long, perfect silence. But I wasn't done. I sent copies of the lease to the preservation group, to the city planning office, and to the local paper's real estate desk. Not as a story. Just, for the record. The next Sunday, the paper ran a small blurb buried on page 7. Local landowner reasserts subsurface rights over contested acreage. "This is more than a transaction," said Hayes. "It's a story. A life. A legacy. No photo. No drama. Just facts." But that line, a story, spread further than I expected. The blog got picked up by a larger network. A podcast host reached out. "We're doing a series on vanishing farmland and legacy betrayal," she said. "Would you be willing to speak?" I declined. But I sent them permission to quote me. By the end of the month, the public image of Ethan's development shifted. No longer, sustainable living for the future. Now it was, controversial project on contested soil. A neighbor I barely knew dropped off a peach pie. "For holding the line," she said. "I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't chain myself to a tree. I just kept walking the land. Quiet steps. Sharp leverage." The public pressure came slowly, like wind through dry leaves, at first just noise, then movement. It started with whispers in town. At the hardware store, I overheard someone ask, "Isn't that Warner kid the one trying to evict his own father?" At the diner, 2 women in booth 4 were talking about heritage violations and soulless construction companies. I didn't say a word. Just drank my coffee and tipped extra. Then came the local radio. Not the big stations. The one that still played vinyl and ran swap meets over the airwaves. One morning, I heard the host say, "That story about the Hayes farm, it just gets under your skin, doesn't it? Makes you think twice about progress." People started emailing the Planning Commission. Concerned citizens. Preservationists. Descendants of other farmers who'd lost everything to bypasses, malls, storage units. Ethan tried to salvage it with PR. He released a glossy video online, drone footage of green hills, slow music, talking points about community and growth. They used the term eco-harmony at least 6 times. Even tagged my blog at the end, like that would smooth it over. It backfired. Comments flooded in. You don't honor a legacy by building over a grave. Stop using your father's voice to sell fake peace. This is elder fraud with extra steps. The next week, the city postponed the development indefinitely, pending further review. Ethan came by the house again. This time, he didn't get out of the car. Just sat there in his shiny SUV, looking up at the porch like it owed him something. I watched from behind the curtain. He stayed 10 minutes. Then left. 3 days later, I received a formal notice. Ethan was dissolving Hayes Heritage Holdings. Quietly. Without fanfare. The LLC would be closed. The land, returned to my name through a buyback clause I never realized he'd slipped in, an attempt to preserve control if things went south. Only now it was his lifeline. His way out. All I had to do was pay the legal fees and taxes associated with the transfer. I paid them that same afternoon. The lawyer's office called to confirm. Mr. Hayes, you'll officially regain title next Friday. I thanked them and hung up. But I didn't smile. Not yet. Because consequences weren't just legal. They were personal. Ethan's name started to vanish from business directories. I heard the Warner Group Realty banner was quietly removed from 2 properties near the highway. A contact at the Chamber of Commerce told me he'd been politely removed from the board. People stopped calling him the son of Roy Hayes. Now they said, that's the guy who tried to sell his father's grave. He left town shortly after. Moved back to Austin. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't leave a note. Just disappeared. And the thing about consequences is, they don't always end in fire. Sometimes they settle like dust. Slowly. Relentlessly. By spring, the land was mine again. Not just in deed. In silence. In freedom. And in the absence of footsteps that didn't belong. The papers arrived on a Thursday morning. Plain envelope. No note. Just the new deed, my name restored, black ink on thick stock paper that smelled faintly of toner and closure. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal. Not for sentiment. For confirmation. Roy Hayes. Owner. Steward. Final word. The silence in the house wasn't heavy anymore. It was earned. Still, there was one more thing to do. That Sunday, I drove to Austin. 10 hours with nothing but engine hum and a cassette tape of Carol reading aloud from Lonesome Dove, recorded in 2005 when Ethan had bought her a voice recorder to start an audiobook club. He never listened to the files. I did. Every mile. When I pulled up to his condo, polished steel, parking garage, too much glass, I sat in the truck for a full minute before getting out. The air smelled like concrete and cooked oil. I buzzed his unit. Once. Yeah. His voice, tinny and cautious. It's me. A pause. Then the door clicked open. He was waiting in the hallway. Pale. Smaller somehow. Dad. Let's not start with that, I said. We walked into the living room. The walls were bare. The couch was too white. The air conditioner made everything feel artificial. You came all the way here. I nodded. Didn't think this kind of conversation belonged on the phone. He rubbed the back of his neck. The way he used to when he got caught lying about test grades. I didn't mean for it to go the way it did. I really thought I could build something bigger. You did build something, I said. You just didn't think I'd survive it. He winced. I never wanted to hurt you. No, I said quietly. You wanted me to disappear quietly. We stood in the stillness. Not angry anymore. Not righteous. Just weathered. I lost everything, he said, voice cracking. No, I said. You lost what you never earned. He sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the floor. I thought if I made enough money, fixed the place up, built something modern, maybe you'd be proud. I was proud, I said. When you were 7 and you shared your last cookie with the dog. When you spent your summer helping me repair the irrigation pump. When you cried during Carol's funeral and didn't pretend to be strong. He looked up. But you buried that boy under business cards. I took the deed out of my pocket and placed it on the glass table between us. I came to return something, I said. He blinked. You thought you were the one passing torches. Giving legacies. Controlling direction. I slid the paper across the table toward him. This is what legacy looks like. When you lose it, you know exactly why. And you carry that. He didn't touch the deed. Just stared at it. I still love you, he whispered. I know, I said. But I don't trust you. That was the line. Not a shout. Not a blow. Just a fact, placed in the center of the room like a stone in the road. He nodded slowly. I want to fix it. You can't. But You can't. I stood. He didn't follow. I'm not here to hurt you, I said. I'm here to tell you there's no version of this where you get the land. Or the story. Or the memory. He was crying now. Softly. Like a child. I'll be leaving it to the land trust, I said. Public stewardship. Wildlife sanctuary. Education access. Carol would have liked that. He nodded, silent. I walked to the door. At the threshold, I turned back once. You tried to bury me, I said. You forgot I was the one who taught you how to dig. Spring returned slower than usual that year. The frost hung on into April, stubborn as the old hounds that still roamed the fence line. I didn't mind. I'd always believed the land set its own schedule. When the thaw finally came, it came all at once, like breath held too long. The creek behind the barn began to sing again, louder than I remembered. The wind shifted. The crows returned. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was bracing for anything. The land had stopped holding its breath, and so had I. I didn't celebrate. I don't think peace ever comes with fireworks. It comes with rhythms. With rituals. Quiet things you don't even know you missed until they slip back into your life without asking. I fixed the back porch railing. Polished the brass on Carol's old garden lantern. Repainted the shutters, a deep green, the way she liked them. And I sat on the bench by the hickory tree most afternoons, reading aloud. Sometimes Carol's old gardening notes. Sometimes local history books. Once, just to test myself, I read a brochure for eco-harmony developments. Got 3 pages in before I burst out laughing. I was 73. My knees hated the cold. My hands ached when it rained. But my breath was deep. My spine straight. And for the first time in decades, my mind was sharp with direction that didn't belong to someone else. The preservation group came out in May. Nice people. Thoughtful. One of them cried when she saw the old photos I'd hung in the barn, Carol with her herbs, Ethan as a boy, me with too much hair and too little sense. They brought a plaque. This land, and the man who held it, remind us what roots really mean. I didn't cry. But I did run my hand across the etched metal and think, Carol would have snorted at this and made tea anyway. The blog was still running. New readers. Kind messages. One young man from Montana wrote, I didn't know men like you existed. Thank you. I replied simply, we're not extinct. Just quieter than the rest. I didn't hear from Ethan again. Not really. A birthday card came in July. No return address. Just 4 words inside. I'm trying. I promise. I didn't reply. Not out of bitterness. Out of truth. Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed again. But I left the card on the kitchen windowsill anyway. Because some seeds take years to sprout. One evening, near the end of summer, I sat by the field edge and watched a doe cross the property line, slow, cautious, her fawn in tow. She stopped at the stake where the developers once marked their plans. Sniffed. Then kept walking. The stakes were gone, of course. Pulled out and burned. All that remained was the impression in the soil, and the memory of what almost happened. Sometimes, when the air was still, I could almost hear Carol's voice in the garden. Not words. Just presence. Like the land remembering who walked it first. I didn't win. I endured. There's a difference. One is loud. The other is lasting. The land doesn't remember signatures. It remembers footsteps. It remembers the hands that turned its soil, the laughter that echoed between its trees, the quiet grief buried beneath its roots. It remembers who stayed. And who tried to sell silence. Ethan thought legacy was something you inherited. But legacy is what grows after everything else is taken. And in the end, when the house falls quiet again, and the wind moves through the cedar like a whispered name, I'll still be here. Not in ink. Not in law. But in the rhythm of the earth beneath my feet. And that will be enough.